Star Trek IV is the perfect opportunity to make up for a 16-year-old William Shatner disappointment. William Shatner has publicly admitted he was upset by a franchise decision made in 2009, but Star Trek IV can finally put the actor's concerns to rest. Although not officially confirmed, Star Trek IV is largely believed to be happening, although it is still stuck in production hell. The ending of 2016's Star Trek Beyond was never intended to be the conclusion of the Kelvin Timeline series, but the huge delay since the third installment makes it seem as though the series is done. Hopefully, Chris Pine's Captain Kirk and the alternate version of the Enterprise crew return soon. The Kelvin Timeline's movies are a reboot with a twist. Although the series never technically needed to acknowledge the franchise's primary Star Trek timeline, J.J. Abrams found a way to fold his story into the main canon in a way that was far more immersive than it just happening in another reality. The Kelvin Timeline's clash with the Prime Universe helped kickstart Abrams' Star Trek movies in 2009 when Leonard Nimoy's Spock appeared alongside the new actors, which was apparently a source of contention for another member of the Star Trek, the original series cast. Star Trek IV can finally make up for Shatner's disappointment at not being the 2009 movie. Because of when 2009 Star Trek was set, it wouldn't have made any sense for William Shatner to reprise his role as James T. Kirk. So Chris Pine stepped into the role to help guide the franchise into its new era. However, the presence of Leonard Nimoy among the cast clearly ruffled a few feathers, namely William Shatner's. When fielding questions at a Star Trek convention in 2017 via Trek Movie, Shatner was told by a fan that they found it disappointing that his version of Kirk never showed up in 2009 Star Trek. The actor replied, "I do too." Years later, Shatner is finally in talks to come back as Kirk, but it remains unclear in what form the reprisal might take. One possibility would be for him to show up in Star Trek IV, if it ever happens. The Kelvin Timeline has already set a precedent in its willingness to bring back established Star Trek actors, rather than sticking exclusively to the recastings. So Shatner's surprise return to the role may not be in the Prime Timeline, but in Abrams' parallel reality. Shatner's proposed Star Trek comeback as Kirk would make sense in Star Trek IV. Although William Shatner's character died in 1994's Star Trek Generations, there are a few ways in which Kirk could return. Most would require retcons or clever sci-fi writing, but bringing Shatner into the Kelvin Timeline would require far less of that. Shatner is already far older than Kirk was when he died in Generations, so it would break canon quite a bit if he were to return as Prime Kirk now, but the eventual fate of Chris Pine's version of the character has yet to be revealed. It's unlikely that the Kelvin Kirk will experience anything like the events of Generations, so he could live far longer than his Prime counterpart. Therefore, Shatner could play Kelvin Kirk from Pine's future in Star Trek IV, who has traveled back in time to speak with his younger self. 2009 Star Trek, doing something similar with Spock, proves that Pine's Kirk will eventually grow to look like William Shatner's, as Zachary Quinto's Spock will eventually transform to resemble Nimoy's version. I've always found this a little strange, but I guess it's a necessary casting quirk. Star Trek IV doesn't need William Shatner, but I'd still love to see him in it. It's been almost a decade since Star Trek Beyond, so there will be plenty to catch up on and potential storylines if and when Star Trek IV ever materializes. Other than Nimoy's role in the first movie, the Kelvin Timeline series has been pretty content to stay in its lane, without constantly referencing the larger franchise. William Shatner's presence could derail that formula, as his Star Trek character has never been central to the reboot movie's plot. Instead, it has been Chris Pine's iteration of Kirk that has led the charge. All that being said, I still think it would be fantastic to see Shatner appear in Star Trek IV. It wouldn't just make up for his cut scene in 2009 Star Trek, but it would also be one of the most high-profile and logical ways for him to play Kirk again. I know there are various sci-fi tropes and mind-bending story techniques that could resurrect Prime Kirk, but I'm convinced his story is best left where it ended in Star Trek Generations. Recalling William Shatner for Star Trek IV, this time as Kelvin Kirk, is a thrilling prospect.